Our next speaker is truly amazing. Her name is Vicki Burns, and she is, as I mentioned before, from ground zero of the PMU industry of Manitoba. Vicki is a tremendous advocate. She was the head and executive director of the Winnipeg Humane Society for 14 years, where she regularly dealt with all kinds of animal issues, but particularly with the PMU industry, which was right in her own backyard. Right now, she's an environmentalist and working on water issues, which she'll tell us more about. But I'm so pleased to welcome her, and she's just the nicest person. Vicki Burns.
Good morning, and thank you, Susan, for that nice introduction. That makes me feel a little bit more relaxed. And I really am very honored to be asked to come and participate in the summit about such an important issue, the welfare of horses. And my little piece of it is to tell you what I know about the PMU industry, what I found out over the past 20 years, and really try to make sure that you all understand, for the most part, what has been hidden behind those barn doors. But right off the top, I really want to make a big confession. Those of you who've already talked to me probably know this, but for the rest of you, I am not an expert on horses at all. But what I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I promise you that I am absolutely passionate, and I will always remain committed to promoting the welfare of animals, and in particular, the welfare of animals who are suffering because of human actions. And the horses in the PMU industry are clearly an example of that. So I really am delighted to have the opportunity to help in wherever it's possible for us to do things to decrease the suffering of other living beings. That is what gives me absolutely the most satisfaction in life. So I'm really happy to be part of this. Thank you. Now, just to start off with a little bit of humor. I just want to, as I mentioned to you, I'm not an expert in horses. In fact, my last two personal up-close experiences with horses were absolutely not dignified. My second last experience, when I was only 17 years old, and that was many decades ago, I had my very first boyfriend owned a couple of horses, and so he offered to take me for a ride. And of course, I didn't know anything about how to ride or anything, but I wanted to be really cool, because you know how it is when you're 17 and you want to impress somebody. So anyway, this is not when I was 17. That was a few years later. But so I got on the horse, sort of pretended I knew what I was doing. We went off on a little, trot through the woods or whatever. And then all of a sudden, my horse decided, I don't want to go in that direction, and you're not that much fun to have on my back. So anyway, took off through the woods. I was just terrified, bending down so I wouldn't get, banged off with a branch of a horse, and ended up back in the stable. My boyfriend came a few minutes later and wondered what the heck had happened. Anyway, I got off the horse, and that was the end of that for about 20 years. This is the next occasion, and anyway, this was a guest ranch up at Riding Mountain Park in Manitoba, where I live, and so some friends and I went for the weekend, and we went riding. And I've always done a fair amount of exercise and so on, but being on a horse, when you haven't been used to it, you're using different muscles, and you're scared. Well, I got off. I think I was like this for about 3 days after, because my legs were so stiff. So anyway, the reason I actually started by telling you these silly stories is because you all, I think most of you here absolutely love horses, and most of you, it sounds like, have had tremendous experiences and opportunities over the years to know horses, to ride them, to be up close to them. But my experience, I think, is representative of many, many other people. Many of the general public really don't have a lot of experience with horses, and or they may have had the kind of minimal experience that I had. And I think it's important for us to recognize that in our efforts to make the changes that we want to see happening, I think it's really important to understand why some of these things that I'm going to tell you about have been allowed to happen behind, closed barn doors, because so many people don't know about it. They don't know much about horses. So you might be wondering, well, gee, I've admitted I'm not an expert in horses. I love all animals in general. I know that's a kind of a crazy or a simplistic thing to say, but really that has motivated me. But why I'm here talking to you is because my professional career took quite a strange turn back in 1994 when I took on the job of being executive director at the Winnipeg Humane Society. I'm actually a social worker by training, and I had spent the first 20 years of my professional life working in various human services. I was executive director of a small an agency for people with developmental delay. And I really wanted a change. So when I saw the ad, executive director of the Winnipeg Humane Society, I thought, well, I've always loved the cats and dogs we've had in our house, so I think I'll apply for that job. I started at the Winnipeg Humane Society in 1994. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about humane societies in general. I had some conversations yesterday with people about some humane societies in the States, and I know from my own personal experience in Canada that many humane societies really remain focused on the plight of homeless cats and dogs. And what happens is that the plight of the many other animals that humans are involved with and humans use for a variety of reasons, often humane societies have not wanted to deal with that. And that's a tremendous source of disappointment to me and frustration. I have to confess that even when I was president of the board of the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies, I was disappointed that I was not able to persuade them to take a much stronger position in certain areas. And I think that, I don't know if that's the case in the United States, but I'm kind of guessing that it is. And personally, I always felt it was hypocritical. Why are we willing to spend so much time and money talking and working on cats and dogs? They deserve it, but so do the millions of other animals that are affected by humans. So shortly after I started at the Winnipeg Humane Society, I don't know why, but people started to phone me, just members of the public. And they said, do you know what happens to, how pigs are raised, for example? And I said, well, no, why would I know that? Well, anyway, as it turns out, I don't know if most of you know, but, intensive agriculture has caused housing systems so that the mother pigs are kept in stalls so small for their entire adult life. So small, they can't turn around, they can take a step forward, a step back, and that's it. I was just stunned by that kind of intensive confinement. I was, became informed about some of the wild animal issues in Manitoba, where we have polar bears, wild polar bears, and people from all over the country come to see them. But it turned out that we were allowing the capture of some polar bear cubs in order to export them and send them to zoos in tropical countries where they languished in these horrible situations. And I learned about the PMU industry. I was then, contacted about the PMU industry. So I've discovered about myself that when I learn about something that seems to be really unjust, I just cannot stay quiet about it. I just cannot live with myself. And well, thank you. So anyways, I became quite a loudmouth. And so some people in Manitoba and in some other areas of Canada really came to love what I was doing. And then there were the ones who really hated what I was doing. So it depends who you know in Manitoba. You might get a mixed reaction to my name. But what in regards to the other animal issues that I've referred to, and in particular PMU, I thought about it a lot because there were so many things that came to my mind, my attention and so on. And what I realized was that it seemed to me that what was going on was very very wrong, because we, in general, humanity, was imposing a lot of suffering on animals because we wanted to increase. Anyway, what I also realized after having two of my own children is that all living beings, us and all other animals, inevitably we experience suffering in our lives. Now, most of you are mature enough to probably have experienced some suffering. We experience it through becoming ill, through the death of a loved one, and through our own death ultimately. So it seems to me that it was really important for us not to set out to say we're going to prevent all suffering in animals, because that is an impossible goal. Animals, like us, are going to suffer inevitably through their lives. But it's a huge difference when you look at the suffering that we are causing, or that we in general, the human species, PMU producers, the hog industry and so on, through what we were trying to do. So there's so many similarities when you start looking at how animals have been used in agriculture. So many similarities because we've been treating them like, or the producers have been treating them as though it's a car assembly line, not as though they are, sentient beings. And another thing that I realized was that when we confine animals so severely outside of their natural circumstances, and we prevent them from doing what they are instinctually driven to do, that causes chronic suffering. And for example, in the hog industry, I'm sorry I keep referring to that, but that's an area that I did, it's huge in Manitoba, and I spent lots of time learning about it. But for example, pigs, instinctually, they want to root around in straw in order to forage, or root around out on the ground to forage for something to eat, and root around and create a nest for themselves. And when they're forced to live in stalls where they can barely move, on slatted floors, no straw, they're prevented from fulfilling their natural instincts. Horses, as you all know far better than I do, but they're prey animals. They've developed with well-developed fight or flee responses, and they're wanderers by nature. And when we confine them to a space so small for 6 months at a time that they can only take a step or two forward or backward, that has got to cause terrible frustration and chronic stress. And so in the pursuit of greater profits, the PMU industry, similar to many other agribusiness industries, they've chosen to treat these horses like automated production line, keeping the animals constantly confined for 6 months of the year, breeding them every year with little break in between. The suffering of the horses, really, if you took away the need to make huge profit and you still wanted to do that industry, things like letting them offline every day, letting them out to move around, breeding them only every second or third year so there weren't all the excess foals. That's a possibility. I'm not promoting the industry at all, but I'm just showing you that what is currently happening didn't have to happen. It's all in the pursuit of profit. For some of you who don't know where Manitoba is, here we are in Manitoba right here, and here we are down here somewhere in upstate New York. But anyway, Brandon, Manitoba, where the Pfizer plant is right around here. So I just thought I would give you a sense of where we are in general. And I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about the history of the PMU industry in Manitoba. The PMU industry actually started in 1942, as Susan told us, but it was mostly in the province of Ontario. Fortunately, there were so many complaints from the public about how the horses were being treated that the government of Ontario, back in 1968, developed some fairly strict regulations, which Lonnie here is looking totally surprised about. As a result, the producers didn't want to bother meeting those strict regulations, so they moved a little bit west. They moved next door to the province of Manitoba, where I am, and also to Saskatchewan. And I'm sorry to say that our governments did not develop those kind of strict regulations. In fact, I think it's really important to look at why are some of these things allowed. And in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, which are very agriculturally based, it's kind of like anything goes. There's this tremendous attitude of, you know, we rely on our farmers and agriculture for our economy, and so if they need to do certain things with animals in order to make money, then so be it. That's the way it is. And I'm afraid that that attitude is contributed to many, many problems, animal welfare being one of the primary ones, and not far behind the environmental concerns. But anyway, so the number of PMU ranches in Manitoba increased, and at its height in 1994, I think there were about 282 farms with over 27,000 mares online in Manitoba. In total, across the rest of the provinces where it was happening, I think there were more like 400 PMU farms. But in 2002, with the Women's Health Initiative report that talked about the tremendous problems, the side effects and so on, the number of farms dropped dramatically. As of today, according to a government person that I spoke to, there are actually 20 PMU farms left in Manitoba, and likely to be less at the end of the year because there's a couple of people retiring. But now I want to tell you about a little bit more specifically, in case some of you aren't that familiar with it, what actually happens in the PMU industry, what is involved for the horses. This image is actually a Manitoba farmer, and you can see all the horses lined up behind him. So I'm going to just talk about sort of the seasonal cycles for the PMU horses. So the horses are put into these individual stalls in the fall, probably around October or so, and they're kept in the stalls solidly for 5 to 6 months, probably let out at the end of March. The reason that they're let off the line at that point is because towards the end of their pregnancy, the estrogen levels in their urine drop, so there's no benefit to really keeping them confined. The stalls, according to the code of practice, which I'll describe to you in a few minutes, so they're supposed to be between 4 and 5 feet wide, that's all. And the horses are fitted with these urine collection devices, UCDs, and you can see the farmer holding that one. You can see he's holding it out to sort of show what it's like. Apparently, the urine collection device is actually attached to the ceiling, and then the tube for the urine collection goes down and goes into a big pail. Here's a sort of cleaner image of it, according to the Court of Practice, and this is an image that came from the NAIRC website, and I'll tell you later what NAIRC is, but they always want to put out some pretty pictures. So the pregnant mare is essentially confined to that 5-foot space for, you know, probably up to 6 months. Anyway, at the end of that period, and then she's let offline, put out to the pasture again, and that's where she has the foal, and then very quickly afterwards is bred again. The foals, according to the Code of Practice, the foals can be weaned as early as 90 days of age, so 3 months, and there's some specific date that they are not to be sold at auction until September 1st. So in case I haven't been quite clear enough on what the animal welfare concerns are, I'm just going to specify a little bit more to you. First of all, the extreme confinement of the horses in the stall. As I mentioned, they can, you know, imagine being hooked up to this device and the lack of space. So they can take maybe a step or two forward and a step or two backward. Otherwise, everything has to be done in that small space. Now, this picture shows a horse that is lying down in the stall, but she's not lying flat out. And as you can see, she couldn't do that. If she did that, she'd be sticking into her neighbor's stalls. So I can't imagine any horse or pregnant horse that would choose to stand up for 6 months, or to even only get a few moments of rest in that way while they're pregnant. I've been told by a friend who's a veterinarian, a horse vet, that of course pregnant mares would choose to lie flat out at least part of their rest time. So that is simply not possible for these. Another very major concern, which I know you all are concerned about, is the byproduct of the PMU industry, and that is the baby horses, the foals. In past years, the majority of foals in Manitoba and Saskatchewan would have been sold to feedlots to be destined for slaughter. There simply, at the height of the industry, there simply was not enough market for 40,000 foals a year. So the situation now has changed in North America due to the reduced number of farms, but as you'll hear later, there's a tremendous push for the PMU ranchers to be selling their foals for purposes other than slaughter. Now I'm going to share some of the information that I received in response to the concerns that I brought forward when I started to learn about this issue. So the response that I got from industry and from the government. Actually, I'll just say that 20 years ago, when I first became aware of the PMU industry, I was still quite naive. I kind of thought, as I thought about many other issues, I thought, I didn't know about this, and I'm guessing that a lot of other people don't know about it, and when I tell them about it, the whole thing's going to stop. Yeah, so that was my naivety, yes. Because what I was just really beginning to understand was what a tremendous stronghold agribusiness had on our politicians and any other decision makers. It was really quite a shock to me, to be honest. And even though I'm not that naive anymore, I still feel shocked sometimes. The psyche of prairie politicians and agricultural producers, where I come from, it's kind of like, you don't dare rock the boat too much or ruffle too many feathers, because we've got to really protect those guys. And it's really significant, not only for, the animals to me were the first thing. They're living beings. We need to do a much better job. But secondarily, the kind of environmental pollution that's coming from this intensive agriculture is really, really serious. Now, when I first got involved in learning about this issue, before I had started to speak too much about it, because I always like to educate myself about stuff so that I can talk with some credibility, and I was actually invited to go to a PMU barn. There was one PMU ranch that would have an open house every year. They were trying to dispel some of the negative images and so on. So myself and a board member drove up to that, and however, that was the first and the last PMU barn that I was ever allowed in, because yeah, as soon as I started to, let it be known what I had seen, there was a desire to not let me see anything more. Now, here are some of the classic responses that I got to the animal welfare concerns, and I have a feeling that some of you are probably familiar with this. First of all, to the concern that the horses are tied up and not let offline for 5 to 6 months, the response was, it's cold in winter. It can almost get down to -40, and those horses, they don't want to leave the barn. You can let them offline, but they're not going to go outside. That was a really classic. Well, I tell you, I'm from a place that does get very cold in the winter. Frequently, it might get down to -30, but you still see some horses outside, and you still know that there are a lot of horses that are offline inside barns that are moving around inside. So that excuse was too simplistic. At one point, I actually, again, before I had started becoming too vocal, I was invited to sit in on a meeting of the Code of Practice Review Committee. And I'll tell you in a few minutes what the Code of Practice is. But they were discussing the issue of exercise for the horses. And I said, you know, why, I don't understand why we can't put at minimum that every horse should be let offline and let out somewhere at least once a week. What would be the harm of that? I mean, really, it should be every day, but if you're not willing to say every day, can't we at least say once a week? Well, I was so shocked when the veterinarian on the committee turns to me and says, well, we don't have the scientific research that says it would be better for the animal. So that was, to me, I hate to say it, but I've seen a few other examples of this, a prime example of where science was being used to refute common sense. And I think we need to be very careful about that. I know we need science, but let's not forget there's some important values to common sense. Now, another situation that early on in learning about this stuff, myself as executive director of the Winnipeg Humane Society, the president of our board of directors, and one other board member, we requested a meeting with our provincial minister of agriculture, a man named Harry Enns. We had to discuss a number of concerns in the agricultural industries, but one of them was the PMU. We asked for his assistance in allowing Humane Society inspectors to go into some of these PMU barns so that we could see how are the horses? How are they actually being treated? How do they look? And so on. Because I don't know about you guys, but when somebody says everything's fine, but I'm sorry, I can't let you see, that really makes me think something's going on here. They're wanting to hide something. That again is common sense, I think. Anyway, so the Minister of Agriculture, Harry Enns, he said no, he would not assist us with this. He knew in no uncertain terms that the general public would not be happy to learn about all these adorable baby foals that were going to end up going to slaughter. He said there was nothing he could do about the situation. And in fact, I found out a couple of years later, I was also shocked about this. He was from a farm background. He was a rancher himself. I'm not sure what kind of ranch, but he had a personal horse. At the age of 27, he decided to ship that horse for slaughter instead of euthanizing on the farm. And this is our Minister of Agriculture. So, with an attitude like that, eh? Now, I've already talked to you about the issue of the horses being not able to lie full out. When I brought that up, because, I mean, as a woman and having had some pregnancies, I figured, the horses are not that different from me. They need to lie down and rest sometimes. I was just told horses sleep most of the time standing up anyway. So, yeah. Now, do you have codes of practice in the United States? No. Okay. In Canada, we have these things called codes of practice that are supposed to, they're developed with input from Humane Society, from agricultural producers, and from government people. And what they're supposed to do is spell out what are the basic requirements if you're going to care for horses, for example. There's a code of practice for pigs and for dairy cattle and so on and so forth. There's actually two codes of practice here, one in general for the care and handling of equines, and then a second specific one for the care and handling of horses in PMU operations. And I found it very, very telling, the differences in a couple of areas in those two codes. It's so blatant, it's almost laughable if it didn't involve so much suffering. So, first of all, in the general code of practice, it spells out that we should allow daily exercise or turnout opportunities, ideally outdoors and with foraging opportunities. So that's in the general code of practice for horses anywhere. In the PMU code, it says every horse on a PMU farm must be given exercise as is necessary for its individual welfare as determined by the operator, the field auditor, or the attending veterinarian. Well, of course, they're not going over every horse and deciding how much exercise that horse needs. That's, they refuse to put in something that at least once a week they have to be out. The second thing is the general code of practice states pregnant mares must have some form of exercise or turnout unless under stall rest for medical reasons or severe environmental conditions make this temporarily impossible. So in other words, in the general code, if you're looking after or raising horses for other reasons, pregnant horses need exercise. That's completely left out in the PMU code. A third thing, in the general code, it talks about how foals would typically be weaned between 4 to 6 months of age. And I don't know if that's correct. Maybe, yeah, I see a few heads nodding. So is that what a lot of horse people would do? But in the PMU code, they talk about allowing it at 90 days, which is 3 months. And I've heard anecdotally that some people have seen foals as young as 8 weeks at the auction house. So the thing is, the industry clearly, the codes of practice are not very meaningful. They're not law, they're suggested, and they're so minimal as to be almost no good anyway. But to see how they're altered in order to allow the PMU business to go on, it's really frustrating. So what's currently happening in Manitoba and Saskatchewan? Well, I just want to, in a way it's good news, except that we know now that what's really going on is hidden behind the barn doors in China. But according to the fellow I talked to at Manitoba Agriculture, he did confirm that there are 20 barns left, 20 PMU ranches left in Manitoba, but likely there'll be less at the end of this season. Here's a news article that talks about how Pfizer cut the number. Pfizer is the company that bought Ayers that now produces the drug Premarin. So anyway, this article was from back in 2010, and it talks about how the 38 of the PMU ranches have been lost their contracts. Also, the actual plant in Brandon that processes the horse urine has cut back significantly. This article is from 2012, and it talks about the number of jobs dropping from 130 jobs to only 80. But I actually was pretty suspicious what really is going on there, and it was pretty hard to find out. I phoned the Pfizer office. I didn't identify who I was. I just said, I said, "Are you hiring?" And anyway, they said, and I made sure to use my husband's phone, so it wasn't my last name on the phone. Anyway, they just said, "Oh, you have to go online and see whether there's any jobs." So I did that, and there were not any jobs advertised at the Pfizer plant in Brandon. Also, I asked, well, how many employees do you actually have right now? And they said, we don't know. They wouldn't give me any information. But I have been assured by other people who are involved in Brandon, not necessarily in the animal welfare side of things, but in the environmental side of things. They have assured me that the Pfizer plant in Brandon has cut down significantly. On the environmental side of things, see, the wastewater that comes from the Pfizer plant is very significant. It's, millions of gallons of horse urine that needs to be treated the same way as human waste. And it was a huge burden on the Brandon wastewater treatment plant. So anyway, I do feel confident that what's happening at Pfizer in Brandon has cut down very, very significantly. However, there is kind of an interesting anomaly to all of this in that when I was looking around to see what was going on, I came across an ad from last September advertising that Pfizer was advertising for the position of the Director of Veterinary Services, Research and Field Compliance at their Linwood Equine Ranch. Now, I'm told that that position is still not filled, but the responsibilities were to plan, conduct, coordinate research and field studies for the continuous improvement in welfare, feeding management, and breeding of horses used to collect PMU. Now, I made some inquiries through some veterinary friends and so on, and it's that job really has not been filled, but I was thinking, why are they advertising that when they're cutting back so much else? So, here's, I think, why. Now, if the industry has shrunk so much in North America, you may be wondering, well, actually, you probably aren't wondering because you know. The reason why we're focusing attention on it now is because we're trying to have people understand that this industry is not dead. It's just moved way over to China. And it's behind those barn doors. And if we were concerned about what was happening here in North America, we should be as concerned, if not more, about what is going on in China. But the Pfizer has, I think, developed some really tremendous public relations efforts. I presume because they don't want women to be understanding what kind of suffering the horses are enduring in order to make this profit. So there are two things that I want to explain to you. The Linwood Ranch and the NAIRC Association. And they're actually, I think they've done a pretty good job at developing some great PR. Just very frustrating to try and make sure that it doesn't really go anywhere. They're trying to really lift the negative images associated with the origins of Premarin and other hormone replacements. Actually, as I was thinking about this and I was talking to Susan and we kind of talked about it a bit, we figured, you know, I guess one reason why they're willing to put a fair amount of effort here is that North American women are still by far the largest market for these products. And so they want to do whatever they can to dispel any of the animal welfare concerns. So first of all, I want to talk about NAIRC. NAIRC is the North American Equine, actually, what does it say? Equine Ranching Information Council. And they have a very well-developed website. You might want to check it out. But one thing that I had not heard about before was this thing called the NAIRC Advantage. And essentially, what it is it's an incentive program for horses that have been bred on NAIRC ranches. And NAIRC ranches are all PMU operations. So it's not that they're, you know, producing horses for other reasons. It's all PMU operations. So they want the ranchers to be registered with them, and then their horses can be registered. And they want the ranchers to have their horses participate in events that will draw some publicity, and then they will pay them something per event and if they place in between first and third position. What I read, some of the disciplines that were included were hunt classes, western classes, barrel racing, cutting, ranch horse, roping, reining, pole bending, trail, dressage, jumping, racing, so on and so forth. There's quite a long list of them. But the other really important thing is they'll only pay you if the results are published on a on a mainstream website or in a very credible equine magazine. So are you getting the drift of what they're trying to do here? They're really, it's pretty smart actually. But I just want to take a minute now, and this is something else that I came across on their website. It's kind of just trying to describe to ranchers, I think, what your life is going to be like if you're in the PMU business. So here they're describing what one farmer says. He says, the horses are fed in the morning, the automatic water systems are checked, The horses are all inspected. We then get the chance to go back in for our breakfast, which oftentimes has not only family members, but any hired hands joining us. After breakfast, we begin to turn out mares into the exercise paddocks, many times in groups of 10 or more, depending on the size of the stable. The collection systems are hosed down with hot water and pressure sprayers if needed. Stalls are repaired and the barn is cleaned out. My wife always has a country dinner ready for all of us at noon. Then, this is the best part. When the kids get out of school in the afternoon, they typically come right to the barn to begin their chores. Because this is a family operation, we really depend on them doing their share to take care of the horses. In the late afternoon, so the horses have been out all day from morning to late afternoon, they say, we bring the mares back into the stable from their turnout pens and then begin the feeding process again. Our final pass through the barn is just before bedtime to ensure the mares are settled in for the evening. While our days are hopefully routine, trust me, we sleep well at night before we start it again the next morning. So I couldn't believe it when I read that, because I thought, here they're not even willing to say they need to be let out once a week, and yet this farmer's letting them out every day, all day. He doesn't care how much urine he's losing. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about the Linwood Ranch. Oh, this is an example of how they do the spotlight on their, NARC has done some spotlight on, if you go to their website, you'll see pictures of beautiful horses and, you know, the awards they've won and the fact that they've come from the NARC ranchers. Now, the Linwood Ranch is actually in Carberry, Manitoba. It's in between Winnipeg and Brandon, very close to Brandon, where the Pfizer plant is for processing the urine. And it's owned by Pfizer. I didn't know about it, actually. I don't know whether it was in existence 20 years ago when I first started getting involved in this. I only found out about it recently, but when I look online and at some of the news stories, it looks like it's been around for about 16 years or something. Basically, that's where they're doing their research about the best management practices for horses in the PMU industry, and that's where the veterinary position is supposed to be based out of, which has not been refilled. They do have a number of horses online in that facility, I think about 50 mares, and they breed horses that can be used for a variety of uses. I'm sure they're definitely trying to not ever have any of their foals go for slaughter, because this is where the industry wants to have all their nice pretty pictures and so on. I just want to show you about some of the stuff they do in the rural area. So this is a small rural community close to Brandon. It's called Carberry, as I mentioned. And here's an article that I found online, although it's from 2011, but it's talking about how the Carberry Agricultural Association is so grateful to the Linwood Ranch because they donate foals to them every year. And they also, you know, help with putting on events and that kind of thing. So what occurred to me here is they're really going to a huge effort in rural Manitoba to have people think positive images about PMU ranches. You know, they've been kind of effective. To sum up all of what I've told you is that the actual PMU ranches in Manitoba and elsewhere in North America have decreased tremendously, and I don't think that we need to fear that they're going to increase, because I think it can be done so much cheaper in China, and there is so much more public attention on it here. But that doesn't mean that we can stop talking about this, because as you're going to hear later this afternoon from a doctor, the whole prescription of hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women is still apparently a really big issue. I personally have never had to use any of that or wouldn't really. But I think it's terribly important for us to figure out how we can keep on kind of shining a light on what this is all about, so that we can ultimately end the suffering of the horses that are involved in this industry. And I think that, you know, all of us, all of you, I've already said I'm not a horse expert, but we need to figure out how to reach out to so many other groups that are not involved in horses, but that ultimately do care. Because even if you don't have a personal experience with horses, lots of people still consider them magnificent, beautiful, wonderful animals. So the challenge is really how to get that message out much more broadly. So thank you so much for your attention. And
Wow. And I just wanted to say that I'm so glad that Vicki went through the whole regimen of what they do with PMU mares and foals, because there's a whole new group of people watching this now that are not aware. I mean, we all are, but most people still don't know. So I thank you for going through that, the whole process. Ray Kelasami told me that one of the reasons they moved to China was to take away the images of the mares and the foals because of the fact that the biggest market is still in the United States. And I just wanted to mention that the FDA approved a new PMU drug, which is sort of mystifying. I don't know why they would do that. It's called Duavy, and it has Premarin in it and another drug called Basidoxifene, which is not approved by the FDA as a standalone drug. So they have a drug in it that is a drug that they haven't approved, plus Premarin. But when you read the notes about the drug, you know, the information that goes with the drug, it says it has conjugated estrogens, but it doesn't say that it has conjugated equine estrogens. So they've gotten away with not having to mention it. And I just asked my own doctor, I said, are you aware that Duavy has Premarin in it? And he did not know. So just because it's made by Pfizer, you know, Ray thought, well, the doctors would assume that it was Premarin because it was made by Pfizer, but my own doctor didn't assume that.